Hi, and welcome to another video by Jim the Car Guy. Today's project, we're going to be replacing this left front axle on this 2008. It's a Dodge Caravan. Now, all of the 2008 on up to the 2016 is the exact same procedure. All right, so let's get in there. I'm going to show you what kind of tools you're going to need, and we're going to get this job done. Okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to get this wheel off of the truck so we can get started on it. All right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to come over here. We're going to remove the Cotter Pin right here on the axle. We're going to take this nut off, and then we're going to take that nut out right there. We're going to remove the bolts on the caliper here and here, and we're going to take this and just move it off to the side for now. We're going to support it. We're not going to let it hang, and let's grab some stuff and get started on it. Now, let me just show you a couple of tools you're going to be needing. You're going to need a large pry bar, a ratchet, screwdriver, some sockets, a pair of cutting pliers, and a couple of sockets. I have 1 1/4, 13/16, and a couple others too. I got like a 30 millimeter. We're going to have to see what size nut this is right here. All right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove these bolts here. We're going to take this caliper off and relocate it. So this one and this one we're going to remove and take the caliper off. And then we're going to hang the caliper by a piece of wire up and out of the way. Those two bolts out in the back, most of the time those bolts in the back, they're either 13 or 14 millimeter. In this case here, maybe you're 12 millimeter, which it is. All right, you just take those two bolts out. And we'll just relocate the caliper off to the side. Sometimes a little bit tight, but it comes right out. Remember when I said about not letting it hang, you want to take a piece of wire or a hanger or something and just relocate the caliper up and out of the way so it doesn't interfere with what you're working on. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take out this Cotter Pin right here, and you just take a pair of cutting pliers and you bend it down like that. Some of these Cotter Pins sometimes can be pretty rusty, so straighten it out the best you can. And then you take your pliers and you grip it by the top and you use leverage to pull it up and out. Right? And then we just take that little block tab off the top of it, and we're going to need to reuse that also. And then we're going to take this nut out right here. This is 1 1/4 inches, by the way. Now, if you don't have an air gun, you can use a breaker bar or a very large ratchet to get it off. But in this case, I am going to use the air because it is a little bit quicker. You also want to make sure at this point that your axle pushes in just slightly, and then take off the lock ring and the nut. If this doesn't push in, you'll need to go in here with a long chisel, and you'll hit it a couple of times on the back to knock it out, and it'll push in slightly towards the transmission. But in this case, it pushed in nice and easy, so we're not going to worry about that. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take out these two bolts up on top of the where the strut goes into the steering knuckle. And again, you can use a hand ratchet to do it, but I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to use an air gun because I can. All right, hold the nut on the other side here, or the bolt I should say, and then you can shoot that nut off. Now, sometimes you're going to find that these bolts are actually frozen and you can't move them, which is the case in these. Sometimes they have splines on it where it pushes it in tight. If that's the case, you take the nut, you put the nut onto the bolt, and then you grab yourself a hammer, and you just tap it a couple times, and it comes right out. Now once you have them pushed out, then you can take the nut back off and you can take it out the rest of the way. Now I'm going to show you what I mean about the splines that are on that bolt. See what happens here? They have all these little grooves on here, so when this tightens in, it pulls it tight in through the knuckle. Alright, so we're going to reuse this again, and we're just going to push this other bolt out. Comes right out. Now what you're going to do is you're going to just take the rotor and the knuckle assembly, and you're going to pull it out towards this way here. Just to keep this rotor from bouncing around, I'm going to just put a nut on this just to hold the rotor in place. Now you may want to take your brake pads off so that they don't fall out later on. I'm not going to, but if they fall out, I'll put them back in later. All right, you pull this out from the strut, and you push in with your finger at the same time, and you can pull the axle out through the back. What I'm going to do, I'll take you down the bottom here and I'll show you what I'm going to do next. You're going to have a bucket down underneath the bottom, and then what we're going to do is we are going to come up underneath here with a pry bar, and we're going to get behind the axle in here, and we're going to pry it out. So let me do that and you can see how it goes. Remember what I told you about putting a bucket underneath there, because sure enough, this is leaking fluid pretty good. And then after you pop it out of the trans, you just get the axle up and out, and that's it. And that's why we had to change it, because the boot blew apart and it was losing all the grease. So let's grab the new axle and let's get this job wrapped up. Always make sure you match up the axle to make sure that it's the same one, because I've seen it many times where the axles are not the right ones. So, all right. Okay, the way you put it back in is you just put it into that opening there where you previously took the axle out of. And you turn the axle just until you feel it line up in the splines inside there, and then you take a hammer and you hold the axle as straight as you possibly can, and you tap it a couple times, and you'll feel it snap right in and locks into the trans, because it has a I'll show you actually. There's a snap ring right up on the top right here, that when you hit this into the gear inside the transmission, that snap ring locks it in place. So make sure it snaps in all the way. You don't want that axle coming back out on you while you're driving. All right, so again, you're not sure it's in, tap on it, and you make sure that it's in as far as it can go. All right, you can take the nut off. Let me change my gloves and we'll come right back. Okay, and we're back. Alright, so the next thing you're going to do is, after your axle is locked in all the way, you're going to put this back through the hub bearing itself. And the way you do that is you just line it up and pull your axle up. and you're mounting, and you take the axle and you turn the axle until you feel it line up with these splines over in here, and then you just rock it back and forth, and you'll see it lines right back up, and you see the axle shaft start to pull through here. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to catch these bolts, and the way you do that is just lift up on the control arm. And you put your second bolt through the bottom. You may have to push in slightly to get the bolt in, but it goes right in. Then what we're going to do is we're going to put those two nuts that we previously took off back on. Again, you can use a ratchet. I'm using air because it's a little bit quicker. You hold the nut on this side with a wrench. Now our two bolts are tight. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to reinstall the nut onto the axle. Now we know the axle came with the new nut, which is what we're going to use. Screw it on by hand as tight as you can, and then take your air gun or whatever means you're using, and you can tighten this in all the way. There is torque specs on that. I didn't look it up, but I will. And last thing we're going to do is put that washer back on. This washer keeps this piece here from rattling around when you drive it. If this was loose on here, you'd hear a jingling noise all the time as you drive it. So make sure you use that washer back on there. And then you line it up with the groove, and you put your cotter pin back through it like that. Tap the cotter pin all the way through. Do is you take the cotter pin and you bend it out. You take the cotter pin and you bend these pieces of the cotter pin out to the side. Same thing on this one here. Alright, then your axle's in. Your axle is in. Your two bottom strut bolts on here are tight. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to put back on our caliper, and we're going to wrap this job up. Okay, put the caliper over the brake pads, and you just rock it back and forth, and you bring it back into where it belongs. And then you can catch your bolts by hand. Same thing on the bottom. And now we're just going to catch them by hand. After they're caught, then you get in here with the ratchet and you tighten them up. I just want to add one thing. When you put your caliper back on, make sure that your brake hose is not twisted. I'll show you what I mean. Make sure that this hose right here is not twisted around. Make sure it's a nice even turn there. Next thing you want to do is right here on the caliper, where this piece, the slide pin, fits into the caliper itself, make sure it's lined up the way it's supposed to. There's only one way it should go on there, and that's with this flat part on the bottom here up against the caliper, and then tighten it down all the way. So let's continue. Okay, so let me just go over a couple things that we know here now. Just to confirm that everything is put back together properly. You tightened up your caliper hold-down bolts, both of them. You tightened up your axle nut. There's a 1¼ inch nut. We put the washer underneath here. We put this pin back through here, and we put the Cotter pin through it to lock it in. We know that the axle is pushed all the way in, as far as it can go, into the transmission, and it's in as far as it goes. And our bolts are tight here on the caliper, on the bottom of the strut. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to put the wheel on. We're going to lower the vehicle down. And remember, we did lose some fluid down there in your bucket. So we need to check the transmission fluid level before we let this job go. Don't forget, subscribe, hit the bell to be notified of future uploads. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.